Ellis County, Kansas, September 1949. The wind, even in late summer, carried a dry, lonely sound across the vast, rolling plains. It was a landscape that tolerated little foolishness, and to the hard-working Volga-German farmers who had broken this sod, the structure rising on Reinhold Adler's quarter section looked like the definition of foolishness. It was a shimmering, half-round tube of corrugated steel, a surplus Quonset hut from the war, sitting strangely on the prairie with no visible foundation. Most peculiar of all, it had no bedrooms. The entire 20-foot length was one open room, a metal shell baking in the September sun. Neighbors would slow their trucks on the dirt road to stare. Walt Schmidt, whose land bordered Adler's to the east, shook his head as he watched Reinhold rivet the final steel panels into place. "The man's building a tin can," he said to Peter Lang, who was in the passenger seat. "A fine oven for the summer, and a coffin of ice for the winter. He's mad." Vernon Ashby, the Ellis County health inspector, made it his business to know about every new dwelling. He'd driven out on an unofficial visit, observing from his county vehicle. He saw a man working with quiet, efficient precision, but he also saw a structure that defied every bit of sensible building practice he'd ever known. It was cheap, yes, fast to erect, certainly, but it wasn't a house. It was a shed. And the rumor was Adler planned to house his wife and 2 young children in it through a Kansas winter. The whole idea was more than foolish. It was dangerously irresponsible. What did this German-Russian CB veteran, a man who had seen both the frozen steppes of his ancestors' stories and the humid heat of the Pacific Islands, understand about the deep Kansas earth that a professional health inspector had missed? This story is about a different kind of wisdom, a knowledge not written in building codes, but carried in memory and proven by the unarguable physics of survival. If you want to understand the simple, powerful principles that allowed one family to sleep in warmth while their neighbors shivered through a polar vortex, you've come to the right place. I promise you will learn something fundamental about heat, earth, and ingenuity. So subscribe and hit the like button. And let us know in the comments, have you ever heard of a house with a bedroom buried underground? Reinhold Adler was not a carpenter. He was not a farmer in the way his neighbors, men who lived and breathed the rhythm of wheat and sorghum, were farmers. He was a veteran of the United States Navy construction battalions, the Seabees. His hands were intimate with the heft of a rivet gun, the sharp edge of a steel sheet, the precise geometry of prefabricated structures designed to be thrown up in weeks on some remote Pacific atoll. He had built the architecture of war, quickly and under pressure. But before that, he was something else. He was a Volga-German, a son of the Norka descendants who had emigrated from the Russian steppes to these Kansas plains generations ago. In his home, the old folks still spoke the dialect, a German preserved like a fossil, and they told the old stories. They spoke of the first settlements along the Volga River, of the brutal, treeless winters, and they spoke of the zemlyanki, the pit houses, dwellings dug directly into the deep, stable Loess soil, roofed with sod, and warmed by the earth itself. It was a folk memory, a whisper of survival from a different continent. That whisper became a shout after his family's first winter in Kansas. They had rented a small, flimsy tenant shack on the edge of town while saving for their own land. Reinhold had been working at the grain co-op, his CB pay barely enough to get by. That winter of '48 was a brutal awakening. He remembered waking one morning to a cold so profound it felt like a physical weight. Outside, he saw his neighbor, Walt Schmidt, standing silently by his new Ford tractor, the green paint gleaming in the weak sun. A dark, jagged line ran through the engine block, a clean crack right through the cast iron at the freeze plug. The engine was destroyed. That same morning, inside their own shack, the kerosene in their main lantern had refused to light. It had congealed into a thick, translucent jelly. Reinhold's wife, Anneliese, had reached into her coat pocket for the small, silver-backed compact mirror she'd had since before the war. It came out in pieces, the glass having shattered from the sheer intensity of the cold that had invaded every corner of their lives. He had looked at his children, Jakob, then 7, and Lena, 5, huddled under every blanket they owned, their breath pluming in the air of their own bedroom. That was the moment the decision was made. He would not fight the next winter. He would sidestep it. The conventional failure of prairie homes was a tragedy of thermodynamics, repeated in dozens of farmhouses across Ellis County every winter. The standard dwelling was a light-frame wooden structure, a balloon of thin walls and single-pane glass adrift in an ocean of Arctic air. It was an architecture of opposition, a direct confrontation with the cold, and it was a battle fought and lost every single night. The problem wasn't just the ambient temperature, which could plummet to 20 or 30 below zero. The true enemy was the wind. On the high plains, a 30-mile-per-hour north wind was not an event. It was a constant. This wind acted like a thief, relentlessly stripping BTUs of heat from any surface it touched. It worked its way through every uncaulked seam, every gap around a window frame, every crack in the foundation. This process, called infiltration, was responsible for the majority of heat loss. A house could have a roaring fire in the stove, yet 6 feet away, the air temperature would be barely above freezing. The fire was fighting the entire Arctic. You could see the evidence of this losing war everywhere. At the Lang homestead, Martha Lang spent half of every November stuffing rags and old newspapers into the sashes of her windows, a futile attempt to staunch the bleeding of warmth. Families would huddle in a single room, usually the kitchen, closing off the rest of the house to conserve fuel. They burned through cords of wood and tons of coal, a constant, exhausting, and expensive effort just to keep the indoor temperature from becoming actively dangerous. These houses were designed to sit on the land, defying the elements with a thin skin of wood and tar paper. They treated the earth as nothing more than a platform to build upon. They ignored the single greatest thermal resource available to them, the ground itself. They saw the prairie as a flat, hostile surface, failing to recognize it as a massive, stable reservoir of energy. Every night, as the temperature of the air plunged, the ground beneath their feet, just a few feet down, remained at a constant, patient, and life-sustaining temperature. Their homes were like boats with enormous leaks, furiously bailing while floating on a calm sea, never thinking to simply plug the holes and use the stability of the water itself. Reinhold Adler understood that the battle was not to be won on the surface. The battle was to be won by yielding, by burrowing, by cooperating with the one element that never froze. Reinhold's project began not with a hammer and saw, but with a shovel and a strong back. He didn't hire a team or bring in machinery. He marked out a rectangle on the plot he'd chosen for his house, 12 feet wide, 14 feet long, and he began to dig. His neighbors thought he was digging a root cellar, a common enough feature on the plains, but he kept going down. 4 feet, 5 feet. He stopped when the floor of his excavation was a full 6 feet below the grade of the surrounding prairie. The soil he removed was not the dark topsoil of the first foot, but a fine, homogeneous, tan-colored material. It was loess, a wind-blown silt that had been deposited over millennia. It was dense, stable, and held its shape beautifully. He had dug not a cellar, but a room, a clean, sharp-walled earthen box. Next came the lining. He bought cheap, rough-sawn cottonwood planks from a local mill. He didn't nail them directly to the earthen walls. Instead, he built a frame inside the pit, leaving a 2-inch gap between the back of the planks and the lowest soil. This gap was his masterstroke. Day by day, he meticulously packed it with clean, dry straw. It wasn't for insulation in the conventional sense, it was to manage moisture. Any dampness that might seep from the earth would be wicked up by the straw and allowed to evaporate into the cellar space, preventing rot and the musty smell of a typical cellar. It was a breathing wall. Only when the subterranean room was complete did he begin work on the structure everyone could see. From a military surplus depot in Salina, he purchased a 20-foot Quonset hut kit for a few $100s. He and Anneliese, with the occasional help of their son Jacob, assembled it themselves on a simple concrete grade beam poured around the perimeter of the pit. The corrugated steel arches went up in a single weekend, a silver half-cylinder gleaming against the endless blue sky. Inside the Quonset was a single cavernous space. At one end, Anneliese arranged a kitchen with a wood-burning cookstove. The other end was their living area, with a table, chairs, and a few pieces of scavenged furniture. There were no interior walls, no hallways, no closets, and most conspicuously, no bedrooms. In the center of the wooden floor, however, was a feature no other Quonset hut in Kansas possessed: a heavy square hatch 3 feet by 3 feet, built like a door, and insulated with a thick core of packed wool. It lay flush with the floor, fitted with a simple recessed ring handle. This was the state of affairs when Vernon Ashby made his first official visit in late October. Ashby was a man who believed in rules and regulations, not out of malice, but because he believed they kept people safe. He walked into the Quonset, his shoes echoing on the floorboards, and looked around. He was polite, but firm. "Mr. Adler," he began, pulling a small notepad from his coat pocket. "I'm here from the county health office. We've had some reports, and I need to inspect the premises as a habitable dwelling." Reinhold simply nodded, wiping his hands on a rag. Ashby made some notes. "I see a cooking area, adequate light from the end walls, but I have a significant concern. I see no provision for sleeping quarters that meet the 1943 Kansas State Dwelling Hygiene Code, specifically Section 4, which requires all sleeping areas to be above grade, with sufficient window area for light and egress." Reinhold didn't argue. He didn't defend. He simply walked to the middle of the room, bent down, and lifted the hatch. A current of cool, still air, smelling faintly of fresh-cut wood and clean earth, rose from the opening. He gestured down the sturdy ladder that led into the darkness. "The sleeping is below," he said. Ashby stared into the hole in the floor, then back at Reinhold, then at Anneliese, who was watching calmly from the kitchen. He seemed at a loss for words. "You intend for your children to sleep in a hole in the ground?" "It is not a hole," Reinhold said quietly. "It is a room. It will be the warmest room in Kansas." Ashby shook his head, scribbling furiously in his notepad. "This is highly irregular, Mr. Adler. Highly irregular. I'm going to have to file a report." The mockery from neighbors was less formal but more direct. Walt Schmidt stopped by one afternoon. "Reinhold, I'm just curious," he said, trying to sound casual. "Where do Jacob and Lena sleep?" Reinhold pointed to the hatch. "Downstairs." Walt let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Downstairs? You mean in the root cellar? You're having them sleep in a hole like gophers? My God, man, the damp will get in their bones. They'll be sick all winter." "It is not damp," Reinhold replied, returning to his work, "and they will not be sick." The talk spread through the small community. Adler's folly, they called it, the man who built a tin shed and planned to live underground like an animal. Anneliese confessed her worries one evening. "Reinhold, the neighbors talk," she said, her voice soft. "They think we are crazy." He took her hands, his own rough from labor. "Let them talk," he said, his gaze steady. "We will be warm." The mistake his neighbors made was in seeing the world only as a surface. They saw the 34-degree air of a polar outbreak as the enemy, an unstoppable force to be battled with fire. Fighting the air directly was a losing proposition, a war of attrition against an infinite foe. Reinhold Adler wasn't fighting the air, he was partnering with the earth. The physics at play were simple, elegant, and ancient. 6 feet below the frost line, the great mass of the Kansas plains doesn't know about winter. Unaffected by the wild, daily swings of atmospheric temperature, the dense lowest soil holds a steady, unwavering 50 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. It is a thermal battery of almost infinite capacity. By digging his sleeping chamber down into this stable mass, Reinhold wasn't just building a room. He was coupling his family's living space directly to this enormous reservoir of moderate temperature. Let's look at the numbers. The cellar was a clean, contained box, 12 feet by 14 feet, with a 6-foot ceiling. This gives a volume of 1,008 cubic feet. The walls and floor of this box were in direct thermal contact with 50-degree earth. The only significant path for heat to escape was upward, through the insulated hatch into the cold Quonset above. But where did the heat come from to make it comfortable? There was no stove, no radiator, no furnace in the cellar. The heat source was the family itself. A human body at rest is a small but remarkably consistent furnace, generating approximately 250 to 300 British thermal units, or BTUs, of heat per hour. Reinhold, Anneliese, Jakob, and Lena, sleeping together in the subterranean room, represented 4 such furnaces. For the sake of conservative calculation, let's say a 5th person's worth of heat was generated by residual warmth from their bodies and bedding. That's 5 people generating a continuous 250 BTUs per hour all night long. Now consider the heat loss. The well-insulated cottonwood and straw walls lost very little heat to the 50-degree soil. In fact, the soil was helping to keep the room warm. The primary loss was through the insulated hatch into the Quonset above. A generous engineering calculation, even assuming the Quonset was near freezing, would put the total heat loss of the cellar at around 600 BTUs per hour. The math was undeniable. Heat generated, 1,250 BTU-HR. Heat lost, 600 BTU-HR. The result was a net heat gain of 650 BTUs every single hour. The cellar didn't drop to the Earth's temperature of 50 degrees. It did the opposite. The constant, gentle heat from the sleeping bodies slowly raised the temperature of the enclosed, stable environment until it reached a point of equilibrium. That point, as Reinhold had calculated from old world knowledge, was a comfortable, steady 68 degrees Fahrenheit. No fire, no fuel, no sound. Just the quiet, persistent warmth of life itself held safely in the embrace of the earth. In January of 1950, the theory was put to the test. A massive Arctic high-pressure system slid down from Canada and parked itself over the northern plains. The radio announcer from the station in Hayes called it a polar outbreak, a once-in-a-decade event. For 12 consecutive days, the temperature in Ellis County never rose above 20 degrees, and at night, it plunged to a soul-crushing 34 Fahrenheit. To make matters worse, a relentless 30-mile-per-hour north wind scoured the landscape, stripping the thin, insulating blanket of snow off the fields and exposing the frozen earth. The wind chill factor was a deadly 70 degrees. For the conventional farmhouses, it was a state of siege. The Lang family's well pump, despite being wrapped in burlap, froze solid on the 3rd day, forcing them to melt snow on their stove for water. Walt Schmidt, who had started the winter with a formidable woodpile, watched it dwindle at an alarming rate. He was feeding his stove around the clock, yet the house never seemed to get truly warm. The living room hovered at a miserable 55 degrees, while the bedrooms were so cold that ice crystals formed on the inside of the windows and on the wool blankets of his sleeping children. Life shrank to a small circle of shivering misery around the cast-iron stove. At the Adler place, the reality was split in two. Above grade, in the Quonset hut, the cold was a real and present force. The metal walls radiated chill, and a cup of water left on the counter overnight was a solid block of ice by morning. They kept their small wood cook stove going during the day, but they didn't have to rage it into a roaring inferno. It provided a tolerable pocket of warmth for cooking and daytime life, a space where they could exist in coats and sweaters. It was cold, but it was manageable. But when evening came, their entire world changed. After supper, Reinhold would bank the stove, letting the fire die down to embers. Then he would walk to the center of the room, lift the heavy hatch, and a different climate would emerge. A gentle, silent wave of still, warm air would rise to greet them, devoid of any scent of smoke or dust. It was the smell of clean earth and dry wood. One by one, they would descend the ladder. The moment their feet touched the wooden floor of the cellar, the brutal Kansas winter ceased to exist. The wind, which howled like a predator across the steel roof above, was completely inaudible. The air was absolutely still. The thermometer on the wall, a simple mercury instrument, read 68 degrees. It had read 68 degrees the night before, and it would read 68 degrees the next morning. Here, the contrast was absolute. Upstairs, water froze. Down here, Anneliese kept a large earthenware crock on a wooden shelf. It was filled with Riebel sauce, a traditional Volga-German staple made from flour, cream, and salt, a thick, savory sauce they ate with potatoes. In any other cellar, the fluctuating temperatures would have caused the cream to separate and sour within a week. But in the unwavering stability of their subterranean bedroom, the sauce remained perfectly smooth, thick, and fresh. Anneliese remarked to Reinhold one night, her voice filled with a quiet wonder, that her own mother's Riebel sauce back in the old country always soured by mid-January if the winter was bad. Theirs was perfect. It was more than food. It was proof. It was a domestic, sensory confirmation of the physics at work. Each night, the family would change into simple cotton pajamas. Jacob and Lena would sit on their bunks, reading a book under the light of a single, low-wattage electric bulb powered by a small generator. There were no chattering teeth, no huddled shoulders. They were simply comfortable. When it was time for sleep, they climbed under a single wool blanket each, not for survival, but for the simple comfort of being tucked in. As the wind scoured the plains at 70 below zero, the Adler family slept peacefully in a silent, warm room, heated by nothing more than their own steady heartbeats. By the last week of January, the polar outbreak had broken all previous records. It was during this deep freeze that Vernon Ashby decided he had to act. The report on Reinhold Adler's illegal dwelling had sat on his desk for weeks. But with the news full of stories of families suffering and even perishing from the cold, his sense of duty was stirred. The regulations were there to prevent tragedies, and a family sleeping in an unventilated hole in the ground seemed like a tragedy waiting to happen. He took the official citation, a formal order for the family to cease using the subterranean space as a bedroom, and set out to serve it. The drive from Hayes was a grim ordeal. The heater in his county-issued Chevrolet sedan was fighting a losing battle, and the windshield kept trying to frost over from the inside. The landscape was a monochromatic wasteland of gray sky and frost-rimed brown earth. The wind rocked the car, and the sound of it whistling past the door seals was a constant, unnerving moan. He turned off the main paved road onto the dirt lane that led to Adler's quarter section. He was about a half-mile from the Quonset when the engine of his car sputtered, coughed twice, and went silent. He tried the ignition again and again, but the engine wouldn't even turn over. Ashby wasn't a mechanic, but he knew what had happened. The small amount of water vapor in his fuel line had frozen solid, creating a plug of ice that was starving the carburetor. He was stranded. He sat for a moment, weighing his options. No other cars were likely to come down this lane for hours, if not days. Walking back to the main road was a long, exposed trek. The only logical choice was to walk to Adler's home and ask to use the telephone to call for a tow. He pulled his hat down tight, wrapped his scarf over his face, and stepped out of the car into the full, shocking force of the wind. It was worse than he could have imagined. The air wasn't just cold, it felt sharp, a physical assault on any exposed skin. Within 100 yards, his ears began to burn with a fierce, painful ache. By the time he could see the dull silver curve of the Quonset hut, the burning had subsided into a terrifying numbness. He knew the signs of frostbite. A genuine fear, cold and sharp as the wind itself, began to creep in. He stumbled the last few yards to the metal door and knocked with a gloved hand that felt like a wooden block. The door opened, and Reinhold Adler stood there, silhouetted against the dim light within. Ashby, his teeth chattering uncontrollably, could barely get the words out. "Mr. Adler, my car?" Fuel line froze. "May I use your telephone?" Reinhold simply nodded and stepped back. "Come in. Annalise has coffee." Ashby stumbled inside, grateful to be out of the wind, but the relief was minimal. The air in the Quonset was still bitterly cold, perhaps 50 degrees near the small banked cook stove. He could see his breath. Annalise, her expression one of calm concern, was getting a mug from a cupboard. She gestured with her head toward the open hatch in the floor, from which a ladder descended. "It is warmer for you downstairs, Mr. Ashby," she said. "Please, go down while the coffee is made." Desperate for any real warmth, Ashby hesitated for only a second. He was the county health inspector, here to cite this very space as uninhabitable, but the numbness in his ears and fingers was overriding all professional decorum. He walked to the hatch and cautiously began to climb down. He was expecting the damp, musty chill of a grave. His mind was braced for the raw, 30-degree cold of a conventional root cellar, a place even colder and more miserable than the room he'd just left. His boots hit the smooth wooden floor. The first thing he registered was the absolute, profound stillness of the air. The howling of the wind vanished as if a switch had been thrown. Then, the warmth registered. It was not the hot, dry blast of a furnace or the radiant heat of a stove. It was a gentle, pervasive, life-giving warmth that seemed to emanate from the very walls. It was like stepping from a storm into a quiet, sunlit room. He pulled off his gloves, his fingers stiff and clumsy. The air felt soft on his skin. He reached out and placed his bare palm flat against the cottonwood planking of the wall. He expected to feel the icy chill of the earth. Instead, it was just neutral. Not warm, not cold. The wall wasn't stealing his heat. The room was holding it. He looked around. 2 small bunks were built against one wall. On one, a little girl with blonde braids, Lena, was looking at a picture book. On the other, a boy, Jakob, was meticulously arranging a set of toy soldiers. They were dressed in simple cotton pajamas. Their faces were relaxed, their hands and feet bare. They were not shivering. Annalise descended the ladder carefully, holding a steaming mug of coffee. She handed it to him, and the ceramic warmth seeped into his frozen hands. He looked at the simple thermometer tacked to a wall post. The red line stood crisp and clear at 68 degrees. He looked from the thermometer to the placid children, to the crock of Rebel sauce on the shelf, to his own hands, which were slowly regaining feeling. The folded citation in his coat pocket suddenly felt like a ridiculous, irrelevant piece of paper from a world that didn't understand anything. Reinhold came down and stood beside him. Ashby, shaking his head slowly in disbelief, finally spoke. "I don't understand any of this," he said, his voice low. "The wind outside. It's dangerous. How is this possible?" Reinhold just gestured to the floor. "The earth is warm." Ashby took a sip of the hot coffee, the warmth spreading through his chest. He looked around the simple, life-saving room again, at the quiet ingenuity that had conquered the brutal Kansas winter not with force, but with wisdom. "My God, man," Ashby said, his voice full of a dawning respect. "You're not fighting the cold. You've just stepped out of its way." He never took the citation out of his pocket. Vernon Ashby got his toe back to Hayes, but he was a changed man. He didn't file the citation. Instead, at the next county board meeting, he spoke not of hygiene codes, but of thermal efficiency and common sense. He described walking from a 70-degree wind chill into a 68-degree room heated by nothing but the people inside it. Most of his colleagues thought he'd spent too long in the cold, but his earnestness planted a seed. The story spread much faster, and more effectively, through the tight-knit community of Volga-Germans. Here, Reinhold's idea wasn't madness. It was a clever echo of the zemlyanki of their shared past. It made intuitive sense. The Volksdeutsche Zentralbund, the Central Community Association for the Germans from Russia in Ellis County, invited Reinhold to speak at their February meeting. He was no orator. He didn't give a grand speech. He simply stood before a chalkboard and, with a piece of chalk, drew a cross-section of his home. He drew the prairie. He drew the 6-foot-deep pit. He drew the cottonwood and straw liner. He drew the Quonset hut on top. He wrote down the dimensions and the materials. He answered practical questions about digging, moisture, and ventilation. He didn't speak of physics or BTUs. He spoke of a warm place to sleep. The effect was immediate. In its March 1950 newsletter, the Zentralbund printed the plan, calling it the Adler Subgrade Sleeping Chamber. That spring and summer, a quiet revolution in architecture took place on the plains. By the time the first snows of the next winter fell, 7 other families, all Volga-German veterans who were comfortable with both Quonset huts and the stories of their grandparents, had built their own variations of Reinhold's design across Ellis and Rush counties. What Reinhold Adler accomplished in 1949, with surplus military materials and ancestral memory, was a masterclass in what modern architects now call passive design and earth-sheltered construction. He was using the immense thermal mass of the planet as a heat sink and a temperature moderator. He had created, out of necessity, a primitive but perfectly functional geothermal heating and cooling system, decades before those terms became fashionable in the world of sustainable architecture. He proved that the most elegant solutions are often not about adding more technology, but about removing the barrier between ourselves and the natural systems that already work. The other settlers on the plains saw the brutal Kansas winter as an enemy, an invading force to be held at bay with thicker walls, bigger fires, and a constant expenditure of fuel and labor. They were locked in an arms race against the atmosphere, a war they could only fight to a costly, shivering stalemate. Theirs was a mindset of opposition. Reinhold Adler's genius was that he refused to fight that war. He changed the fundamental question. It was not, how can I make my house strong enough to defeat the cold? But rather, where is a place that is already not cold? He understood that the most powerful force on the prairie was not the winter wind, but the deep, abiding, and constant warmth of the earth itself. He didn't build his bedroom against the winter. He simply asked the earth 6 feet down to be the room. And in the deep, silent loess of the Kansas plains, the earth, as it always does for those who listen, said yes. If this story of quiet ingenuity and practical wisdom has earned your respect, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories of forgotten history and timeless engineering. We believe these stories are more than just entertainment. They are a vital reminder of what is possible. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. What other old-world techniques do you know of that solve modern problems? Disclaimer: this video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices and building science. Any application of these, or similar techniques in a modern context, should be done in full compliance with current building codes, safety guidelines, and local regulations. This content does not constitute professional engineering, architectural, or legal advice.